On this computer. Okay, I did everything. I am recording it. I don't know. Oh, she hadn't dried her hair. Okay. We're starting, guys.
There are a whole bunch of people. This weather thing that we've had, there are people suffering, people whose houses, it only takes an inch of water in your house to be flooded. It makes a mess. And we need to remember, and we need to help where we can. But I don't know if the whole world is going through this, if our little group has more than its share. I don't know. Lisa Harwell just told us she had her car stolen. She lives in a gated community, and it was in the garage. And they stole her car. And because it was like right at her birthday, she couldn't rent a car because her license expired right then. And she's just been, but you know, and Dee and I are talking about things. People are wound up really tight right now, and it seems like it's getting worse. And this thing starts in the time of the judges, when it says each man did what was right in his own eyes. And I'll throw the women in on that. Each man and woman did what was right in their own eyes. But we seem to be on one of those times. And the idea of when they were told you're the salt of the world, you're the light of the earth, that's our salt of the earth, light of the world. That's who we're supposed to be. And we have a place. As these things seem to progress, we have a place. And to see people who are not wound up tight, people who are not on the edge, has some value. So keep that in mind. And I want to mention Jim Allen. We've prayed for him. His last blood work came up such that he couldn't have the next round of chemo. He's got one more they want to give him, and then he goes to radiation. So keep the whole family in your prayers. Kelly's not with us, and we haven't had an update, and I worry about her. And
Alton and
Kathy's not here, and we remember Kathy and Alton along with Phil and Cherie every single week. When you have to do that, it's a tough time for people. When we wind up week after week having to remember, so please do remember. And then our Julie is just doing really, really bad. I don't know. We're going to have to. There's another time we may have to rattle the trees a little bit. They've been good, but it's hard sometimes to convey a sense of urgency over the phone. So I don't know what we'll do about it. God, in the middle of all these things, we still find reason to be thankful. We still find reason to acknowledge, to remember that you're the maker of the universe, that you are the creator and the sovereign of all of this. And we know that this place has rules. You made a place that works. And yet we go through these times that it's very difficult when we're on the receiving end, and you know our hearts are with these people. We keep coming back, we keep remembering it because it's what we're supposed to do, but because we know that hope ultimately comes from one place. We're about to study with all of these people. You see people who come seeking you. We ask for your blessing that they find what we seek.
So we are starting the book of Ruth. We're doing a study on women in the Old Testament. And just to back up one step, why are we studying women in the Old Testament? A couple of reasons. First of all, to dismiss the myth out there that there aren't women in the Old Testament and they weren't important, because there are and they were. One. And two, these women, just like the men in the New and Old Testament, are, their stories are not only interesting and fascinating, but surprising who they are. And when you get to know who they really were, they weren't perfect people. God uses everybody, and God can use us, and God does use us. And as Scott was talking about, the salt and the light of the earth, if we're supposed to be that, he can use us even if we aren't perfect, which we aren't. The other thing that hit us this week when we were studying, and we're going to start the book of Ruth. And so far we've done Deborah, and Deborah was a judge. And then we sort of went backwards and we did Rahab. And Rahab was the prostitute that helped the spies. And then now we're going back to Ruth. And just to put Ruth in historical context first, Ruth came at the time of the judges, after Deborah. Deborah was a judge, but she was at the beginning at the time of Judges. And Ruth was towards the end at the time of Judges. So everything was going pretty south, is a good way to say it. Ruth was probably at like 1100 BC, before Christ, to give you an idea of when Ruth was. One New Testament biblical citing or quote that kept coming to us when we were studying, and I want to start with it, and then I'm going to turn it over to Scott, is Romans 8:28. And this is something that many of us hear all the time. And we know that God works all things together for good for those who love him, who are called according to his purpose. And it's probably one of those very misused things, but the story of Ruth, if it doesn't explain what that means, I can't think.
I want to know what he meant by that. The story of Ruth encapsulates it as well as anything you'll hear, and it's these things that totally unforeseeable disasters, and yet it winds up working. These things wind up working together for good, and we clearly see by the end an amazing good that came of this that no one could have foreseen at the beginning.
One other thing, so some of you have actually been in our Bible study when we've done Ruth before, and it's, my mom's favorite quote that I'll use all my life. We're not done with this book yet. I mean, every time we come back to a passage or a book in the Bible, it depends on how you're looking at it and why you're looking at it and when you're looking at it. So even if you've studied the book of Ruth, the insights Scott and I were getting this week, even though we've studied it before, definitely. And this is like, as we study women in the Old Testament and the fact that God uses everybody, you come with a different thought. Do you want to talk a little bit about, before we start reading, about how the book of Ruth came to be and what its purpose is today?
And this is important to understand. They're going to be, for those of you who study on your own, if you come across commentary, it's important to understand some things about Ruth. First of all, it was told orally for a fairly long period of time before it was ever written down.
Like more than 100 years.
yeah, a long time. So this was something, the story is told and retold at some of their celebrations. Sometimes it's just, family gatherings. And so it in places, it reads almost like a play because that's the way it's handled. We saw this last version that we saw of, or episode of The Chosen. And they're actually at one of the dinners, one of the festival dinners, they reenact sort of the story of Hanukkah and the story of the Maccabees, and it is how these things were carried down. Don't think because they were done orally that makes them inherently inaccurate, because they're very meticulous, and the generations hear these stories, and if somebody telling it leaves a part out or gets a part a little bit wrong, people in the audience will no, you forgot the part about this, or you forgot. these things, and if you've ever seen, like at the Wailing Wall, you'll have in Jerusalem, you'll have people reciting scripture, and they sit in a rock as they do it. That's a device that they use to help them memorize. So the fact that it was told orally doesn't mean that it's inaccurate. In fact, very accurate on most of these counts. But the other thing that you need to know up front is how important names are. And we've read through, as we've done studies, there are people whose names are really strange. You know, they come up totally appropriate, and you think, why would somebody name their child that? They probably weren't born with that name. Now, we accept the idea that Peter received a new name.
It was Simon, then he became Peter.
Simon and then Peter, or Saul became Paul. Abraham becomes Israel. I don't know. That doesn't seem to bother people. But when we get to stories like this, well, I'm going to tell you up front that there are some names in here that are part of, when I say that this was done almost like a play orally, these names are given to tell you who the person is. It's not their given name. It wasn't. And you just have to learn to be okay with that. They understood it. We don't seem to. And I see people get all hung up. Nobody would be named that. Well, no, they wouldn't. There's literally a place, we won't get to it this week, but there's a person who's called by name in the book of Ruth, except the name he's called literally means such and such. It's like, oh, it's so-and-so. His name is not important. And he's literally called, that's just so-and-so. They don't want to distract from the story. And so they give people, for the story, they give them, now there are names in here that are historical, and we'll talk about it. But it's a funny thing how important names are to the story, but how important it is to us. So keep that in mind. If you find it too disturbing, we'll talk about it. But it shouldn't bother you that much.
So Ruth is 4 chapters, and even today, is it Shavuot? Shavuot, which is one of the festivals, Jewish festivals that conservative Jews do every single year. And when they go to Shavuot, they always read the book of Ruth. Okay, so this book of Ruth is read every year by Jews during Shavuot. Shavuot's a 7-day festival, and it is commemorating the Torah being given to them. And one of the things, right?
It has meant several things over the years, but now they talk about it as the giving of Torah, giving of the law to man. But this book remains important even today. It is a part of the culture.
Okay, so we are on Ruth, and so Ruth in your Bibles is right after Judges. Okay. So in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a certain man from Bethlehem in Judah, with his wife and 2 sons, went to reside in the land of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah, and they entered the land of Moab and settled there.
So you see, it starts out with them being nameless. It tells you this is the time of the judges, and we now, all of you that have been through these studies, are, it's part of you. This is a horrible time. I mean, this was a time that it was dangerous to live. It was frustrating to live. It was a struggle. Time of the judges. And you notice it says there was there was famine in the land, and a certain man from Bethlehem. So there's this sort of vague, it's just a guy. And then it says the man's name. It's kind of weird because they just told us it was a guy. And then they tell you the names. But you look at the name, Elimelech means my God is king. Melech is king, Eli. Anyway, it means my God is king. His wife's name is Naomi. That word, now this is a name that's actually a name. It means pleasant. That's the sort of thing you want to name your kids.
And she's a main character. She's throughout the story.
That's right. The man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi. And his two sons were Mahlon and Chilion, right? Mahlon means sickly. And Chilion means wasting away.
So would you name your kids that? I'm just thinking.
What we're going to see in just a moment is that both boys die. And I think it's horribly likely that one of them contracted a sickness and the other one probably some sort of cancer and just wasted away. So they're named for this story. You know who and you know why they died. You know a little bit about them. Beyond that, they're not important to this story. There's, for those of you who know Monty Python, at the beginning of one of the movies about King Arthur, there's like they're doing credits. There's Sir Gawain, there's Sir Lancelot, and then there's one they call Sir Not Appearing in this film, right? Well, I don't know why that's the joke of it, but that's what these are. These are Sir Not Appearing in this film. We know that they're part of the beginning of the story, and then they factor out, and we don't hear about them anymore. We're not really supposed to.
There's a famine.
The names themselves are precursors, I think, to the relationship between mom.
He doesn't have a mic. We
and the children.
Killian. Oh, he has one. He does have one.
The loving relationship between the mom and the children. The devotion. I don't know about this.
Well, I know about that one. That one's on. That one's on, just in case you I don't get Jim.
And Mario, I left one. Okay, sorry.
Gene, it doesn't cease to be important. They don't cease to be important to Naomi, for instance. They don't cease to be important to Ruth. It's just the names. What I'm saying is they're not really characters in the story. They actually factor in, though, huge, tremendously. It's just what I'm trying to get people to see is that these names were selected for the telling and not for the history. That's the point.
And then, so there was a famine.
Yes.
And first of all, they lived in Bethlehem, and then they said they left Bethlehem and they went to Moab. Is that a good thing?
Here we go. So first of all, Moab is across the Jordan, and they were told not to intermarry with Moabites. And as we've mentioned before, it has to do with the fact that people will be drawn away to these gods, to Baal, Asheroth. So they were instructed not to intermarry. And this is the promised land. This is the place they were promised by God. There are people today who judge this and say, well, the famine, they were supposed to stay there and they sinned by leaving. Well, I don't know. Joseph takes Mary and Jesus to Egypt, doesn't he? We don't know if Elimelech felt like he was led to pack up and leave. We don't know. There's a reason we don't know, because we aren't told. But again, if you study on your own, probably most of the commentaries, the sermons, talk about how
he was punished.
He was punished. All this happened as a punishment from God. I see all of this happening as a plan, and part of a plan that it led to what comes after.
One of the ministers that we listened to this week, I thought he did a good job of saying, we don't know if Elimelech was supposed to take his family to Moab, right? If he prayed and God told him, you know what, part of the plan, go across the river, go to Moab, he was supposed to. If he didn't pray and he decided to do it on his own, he probably shouldn't have done it. We don't know.
But what you should see is, let's for a moment assume that they're right. And they shouldn't have left the promised land. They shouldn't have gone to Moab, and they were punished. Let's just say that. Consider how spectacularly well this all worked out, even if a guy did something wrong. what Mary started with, I really appreciate you doing, by the way. This idea that God works all things together for good for those who love the Lord and are called to his purpose, one way or another. Instead of worrying about did they do the wrong thing, they left. They went to Moab.
Then Naomi's husband Elimelech died, and she was left with her two sons, who took Moabite women as their wives, one named Orpah and the other named Ruth. And after they had lived in Moab about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her two sons and without her husband.
Now, this you have to understand. She's in desperate situation, dire straits, whatever you want to call it. This is not a good time to be a widow without sons, without somebody to look out for you when you get older. She's in bad shape. Her husband dies, her two sons take Moabite wives, and then both of them die. She's in trouble. This is going to be a very, very bad time for her. And she does, what's natural. You're going to see that she's going to go home.
And once again, God said for them not to intermarry, and they did intermarry.
That's true.
But once again, all things, God takes all things and works it out for them.
If you must look at that, the fact that they both took Moabite wives, if you absolutely must look at that and focus on, well, they sinned, they didn't follow. I'm not advocating that we just get to decide when to do what God tells us and when not to. Keep in mind through this whole story about things being worked together for good. That's where the story goes.
When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had attended to his people by providing them with food, she and her daughter-in-law prepared to leave the land of Moab. Accompanied by her two daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road leading back to the land of Judah.
Yeah, for just a moment, if you look at that verse, it's 6, right?
Yeah.
When Naomi heard, listen to how this is phrased. This is no accident. When they heard that the Lord had attended to his people by providing them with food. It doesn't say that, they got some rain, they got the locust went away, that suddenly there's food in Israel. Look at how they phrase that. The Lord had attended to his people by providing them with food. When this is being told to the children, to the next generations, these kind of things figure large. That it's the acknowledgement that God provided, that to remember to acknowledge and to be thankful. And it's in here absolutely as it becomes part of their DNA. It should become part of ours.
And if you're looking at your Bible, Lord is all capitalized, and that means Yahweh.
That is Yahweh.
This is. Okay, verse 8. Then Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, go back, each of you, to your mother's house. May the Lord show you loving devotion as you have shown to your dead and to me. May the Lord enable each of you to find rest in the home of your new husband.
So we want to, may the Lord show you, and remember, they're all packed up, but she says, go back to your mother's home. May the Lord show you loving devotion.
Anybody?
Jean, I'll be disappointed.
Chesed.
It's Hesed.
Hesed.
And Chesed.
Yeah.
I'll talk about it an awful lot when we're in the Old Testament. I'm telling you, it is probably the most important word in the entire Old Testament other than God. This Hesed is what we would call grace. It is loving kindness. It is shown from one who has power and could be in a position to ignore a lesser person and instead does something that they have no hope of being paid back for. That's Hesed. It is grace. It's a beautiful thing, and it's in throughout the entire Old Testament. So may the Lord, may Yahweh show you Hesed as you have shown shown to your dead, and may the Lord enable you to find rest in the home of your new husband. So these two girls are both widows. This is not a good time.
Widows died in
they,
this time of starvation.
They struggled, and if you don't have children to help look out for you, you're in trouble. So she's presuming that these girls are going to get new husbands because they need to. And may God show you his grace, his loving kindness in making sure that that happens. There is a thing called levirate marriage. And it doesn't have anything to do with the Levites, even though it sounds like it would. It's not unique to Israel, to the Jews. But the bottom line is, if a husband dies, then one of his brothers is then supposed to come and conceive a child to carry on the dead brother's line. And we struggle with this idea that it's just as if that child was fathered by the dead husband. They don't even question it. We get hung up on this. They didn't. So the idea is that for the line to keep going, it's especially important for the Jews because they have this inheritance. And so the land, should travel through that line. So it's important for a whole bunch of reasons, and it's going to figure large in the story.
Does this line equate, as said, with human loving one another, this loving devotion, like you have shown your dad and me? I mean, they're not even Christians.
Well, can God bestow his said on people that none of them are Christians because Christ doesn't come for another, 1,500 years, 1,300. But
Yahweh.
It is, that's right. And it is, though, if you begin to see this word has said so constantly through the Old Testament, it is absolutely at the heart of God's plan for humanity. And this is how we are supposed to deal with each other. And the beauty of Hesed, as I told you, is that it usually flows what you would think of as downward, although that's problematic. But you wind up bestowing this loving kindness on people with no hope that they're going to do something for you in the future. You're not going to get repaid. You're not going to get some benefit. They're not going to be a constituent who votes for you. You just do it because they're in need. And yeah, I mean,
and if that isn't definition of how a Christian should act, that definitely is.
It is. You see it flow through then to the teachings of Jesus. It's been consistent, though. This is God's plan for us. And I'll say it again, just in case you missed it. Chesed, in my opinion, is the most important word in the Old Testament other than God.
And it's so fun
yes,
when you went to...
You've got a mic over there?
Yeah. So to me, he's like foreshadowing the story of the Good Samaritan.
Yeah.
Because
absolutely.
The Samaritans and the Jews, they did. And the Samaritan takes care of his arch enemy and prepares a place for him to be recuperated and pays the guy to like being in the hospital. And if it costs more when I come back through, I'll pay it.
And he expects nothing.
He gets nothing out of it.
The beauty of the Samaritan is he had every reason to expect that this Jew would snub him after he woke up and got brought back to health, that he wouldn't want anything to do, he won't want anything to do with me because I'm a Samaritan and I'm going to do it anyway. And it was done in such a way that it's the Samaritan who's bestowing Hesed. It's the Samaritan who they treat as outside outcast that's actually exhibiting the kind of behavior that's expected of us, what's given to us. Yes, John Paul, that is, it's foreshadowing. It's all one big long story. It's just a way of saying later on with the Samaritan, I'm going to tell you the same thing. You got told this back in Ruth. I'm going to remind you of it with a different, different story. You're right.
What I was going to say, it's real fun. Like when you're reading Psalms, sometimes Psalms, I read them and I think, I'm not sure what that exactly means, or it doesn't pertain to me. But as you start reading the Old Testament and all of a sudden you see the words loving devotion, loving kindness, and I start underlining them there, it's everywhere. Like you said, it is a concept that, because we don't know the language the right way, we miss it. But that idea of said is everywhere.
It is through the Old Testament. And I guess one other thing that you kind of should have gotten this, but if these two girls actually go with Naomi back to Israel, they're nothing but Moabite women. Yeah. You're just two people from out of town. They're not going to have
bad town.
Yeah, right. Yeah, from across the tracks. They're not going to be accepted, and Naomi knows that. She suspects it. It may turn out differently, but when she tells them, "Go back to your people," because she's trying to be nice. She is doing for them what she really strongly believes is the only way they're going to survive in this world. It's going to be bad enough, Naomi thinks, for me to have to go back as a widow. 3 of us, and they're Moabite women. This is bad. So she's being kind to them, telling them, go back to your family, because that's where they have the most hope.
Oh, and one thing I didn't say, so how far are they away? It's about 50 miles, okay? So it's about 50 miles from Moab, where they are, to Bethlehem, where they're going back to.
That's pretty cool. I didn't know
that. You know me, I like the numbers. Okay, I'm on verse 9, halfway through. And she kissed them, and they wept out loud and said, surely we will return with you to your people. But Naomi replied, return home, my daughters. Why should you go with me? Are there still sons in my womb to become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. Go on, for I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was hope for me to have a husband tonight and to bear sons, would you want to wait for them to grow up? Would you refrain from having husbands? No, my daughters. It grieves me very much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. Again, they wept out loud, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her.
So you see the levirate marriage come up. She's saying, if you come with me, you got nothing.
Because I can't.
If I had a half dozen sons, then they would perform this levirate marriage function, and you would have a lineage, then someone to help you in your old age. You'd have a family. I don't have any other sons to bring to you, and I'm old enough. Even if I had one tonight, would you wait till they're old enough to become your husbands? You really are you're in a pickle here. Go back home where you have some hope. Orpah, and you see them wailing, crying out loud. In the Middle East, people mourn. They wail. We think it's distasteful if people get that carried away with themselves, but they do. They weep out loud. Orpah leaves and goes home. Ruth says, I'm not leaving you. And what you're about to hear, kind of the back and forth, we've heard part of it, but I want you to picture going to dinner. I think hopefully everybody's been there. You go to dinner with people and one person says, I'm paying. And the other one says, no, you're not paying, I'm paying. And there's a big fight. At least I'm getting some heads, not up and down. So this isn't totally alien. And finally, you realize that the other person is not going to be dissuaded. So you just say thank you, right? That's what's going on here.
We haven't gotten to that.
But you can.
Nobody wants to pay these days.
Nobody wants to pay. You're paying. No, I'm not. You're paying. You're probably right. but this is what's going on. Ruth is sure that she knows what's best. Or Naomi is sure that she knows what's best for Ruth. Ruth has clearly been exposed to Yahweh and to their way of life and to Naomi. And she says, I know Orpah left and I don't blame her, but I'm not leaving you.
So listen to this. We're on verse 15. Look, said Naomi, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and her gods. Follow her back home. But Ruth replied, Do not urge me to leave you or to turn from following you. For wherever you go, I will go. And wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord punish me, and ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me. Then, when Naomi saw that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped trying to persuade her.
Okay, fine. Thanks for paying. That's the thing. By the point she realizes this section of Ruth telling Naomi, I'm not going to leave you, is a beautiful thing. And if you notice, it's indented, right? It's lyrical. It is poetic. It was part of an oral telling. And so it was intended to be that way. It doesn't mean it's inaccurate. Keep that in mind. People love to tell you that they weren't singing to each other. The whole thing is a myth. It is historically really pretty good.
And it's one of those quotes that we often hear, and it's just a beautiful, I will go wherever or I will go, and wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. And that's the remembrance. And then she says, where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord punish me, Lord, so that's Yahweh, punish me, and ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me. I mean, this is a woman who grew up with Canaanite religions, with Baal and Asherah, and somewhere, we don't know how, was it Elimelech? Was it Naomi? Was it her husband? She learned about Yahweh, and she is willing to follow him.
And she literally becomes part of the assembly of Israel. And she becomes a believer and follower of Yahweh. How did she do that? How was she able to do that? And the answer is really simple, because she said so. She believed it, she had faith, and she said, I'm doing it. And it is the faith that she expresses, your God will be my God. She says Yahweh. She knows what she's talking about. She has an understanding of what she's doing. And she's saying, your people will be my people. Rather than focus on Ruth at this point in that story, one of the examples I like to give is, if you remember the singer that was Prince, and then he changed his name to a symbol and we couldn't say his name. But Prince dies from a drug overdose. And Prince makes often a profession of belief, of faith. He's a believer. And there are people who would like to discredit that and say, well, he wasn't a real believer because he died of a drug overdose. Really? Really? You have the ability to make that sort of judgment on another person? Bad habit of presuming to understand someone else's faith relationship with God. And so she says, your people will be my people. She understands what that means. And she says, your God will be my God. She has chosen Yahweh at that point. And yes, faith is the element. And that's what we're seeing. Never be inclined to discount when another person tells you, I believe. Yes, sir.
I have a question for you. I don't want to sound condemning or judgmental myself. There seems to be some kind of insinuation in the Bible about some characteristics of the Jews.
Yes.
And that they're, let's call them, they have righteous prejudices.
They are a stiff-necked people.
For lack of a better word, okay?
Yes.
So you say that even to this day, at whatever festival Mary mentioned, the story of Ruth gets told.
Yeah.
So
how do you line those two things up? People who are stiff-necked and exclusive, and then even today, all this time later, this story of Ruth, the Moabite, I say this periodically when you deal with the Jews, it's never that simple. If you think it's simple, rethink it. It's never that simple. They are very pragmatic, practical people. Part of the thing is, and we saw this even in Israel when we lived there, that you think that the Israelis and the Palestinians are constantly at each other's throats. They live together. There have been through history tribes, clans that were part Arab and part Jew. Nobody wants to tell you that. And if you don't hear it anywhere, you only hear one side, then we come up with an understanding that's sort of warped. It's just never that simple. We know that they intermarried with Moabites and Canaanites and all these other people. It happened. The people at the top, when the temple is built, and the people who wind up running it become politicians. And politicians love to divide people. And so part of what you're referencing becomes more prevalent the later we go into this. But it is never simple. If it looks like it should be simple, you're on the wrong path. It really isn't. And I have read so much history of the Jews, really solid documented history to understand that the rules are flexible.
You know that this little, I don't know what you call it, poem, or lyric to song.
Right.
It's really, I'm hearing, and maybe some of my Catholic background, I'm really hearing the marriage vows. This woman is saying, I'm yours for you, for your God, for your faith, for everything that's yours is mine. I'm even going to die where you die. Well, and I think that is a tremendous.
We don't like sermonizing. Okay. There's some things about sermons that we try and teach, but it's probably also the idea of marriage. Gene said that in this, he hears something very similar to the marriage vow. And our relationship to Christ is likened to a marriage as well. It doesn't mean that it's exactly the same, but the principle is there. You're not mistaken, Gene. It absolutely, these things are, but that's the beauty of the life that's given to us, that's set out for us.
Verse 19. So Naomi and Ruth traveled until they came to Bethlehem. When they entered Bethlehem, the whole city was stirred because of them. And the women of the city exclaimed, can this be Naomi? Do not call me Naomi, she replied. Call me Mara, because the Almighty has dealt quite bitterly with me. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? After all, the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has afflicted me.
So you see in this idea of names. People struggle with Melon and Kilion, sickly and wasting, that this must be a myth. Here's this woman who comes back to her hometown, and they say, oh my gosh, is this Naomi? And she's got these two, she's got this Moabite with her. Can this really be Naomi? But look at what she says. Don't call me Naomi. Naomi means pleasant. The name literally means pleasant. Great name to name, your baby. Don't call me pleasant anymore. Call me Mara. That means bitter, because the Lord has dealt bitterly with me. Now, you'll see by the end of this, she has a different perspective. But at this point, what she perceives is that God's been mean to her. Lots of people, I won't presume to say everyone, but at some point or another, most of us get an opportunity to feel this way ourselves. Well, God is being unfair to me. And very often you see things work together for good. So is there a lot of people read things into, can this be Naomi? Oh, you're not so you know, you ran off. Now you're coming crawling back. That there may be some of that there.
And it's been 10 years. It's been 10 years since she's been there. I'm sure she doesn't look the same and no worse for the wear. I mean, she's lost her husband and 2 sons.
It's been 50 miles of hard road.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing somebody pointed out, you know, remember, Ruth lost her husband and Naomi lost her husband. They both lost their husbands. And as Scott says, by the end of the story, Naomi will have a bigger understanding of part of the bigger picture, at least in her lifetime. But Ruth is someone who lost her husband and doesn't want to be renamed bitter. I mean, she, you know, so both of them have had a tragic thing happen in their life, and they make a choice at this point to look at it.
It's a very good point. We do see that the way this is handled, the way that it's experienced between these two women is pretty different. Ruth is Naomi is bitter, and Ruth, we don't see any signs that she is. And they've both gone through very similar.
So Naomi returned from the land of Moab, and her daughter-in-law Ruth, the Moabites. And they arrived in Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest.
Barley harvest is early spring. They plant it in the fall. It comes up in the spring. Probably in this part, it's April, give or take. And it's important too that they come in at the beginning of the barley harvest. That's gonna come to light. There is within the law, within Leviticus, it's another place too. I think maybe it's in Deuteronomy, but they're told explicitly when you harvest your fields, don't harvest all the way out to the end of the rows. And as you're harvesting, some of this grain or grapes or whatever falls, don't bend over and pick it up. When I remember the first time my dad built a house, and the carpenters, nails are expensive. You know, my dad's tight, and he wants them to pick up all the nails. And the guy explains to him, it costs you more money for us to take the time to pick up the nails than for us just to keep working. So don't bend over and pick up the stuff that has dropped. But this isn't for efficiency. It specifically says for the widows and the orphans and the sojourners, the travelers, the people who don't have, it's built into Jewish law that you don't take every last speck out of your fields. You explicitly leave some for these people to come and glean. Now, you could say, well, why don't they just go ahead and pick it up and at the end of the day deliver some of it to the poor and needy? Mario, you want to? I see Mario's back there almost salivating, because it's important that these people participate in this. It is, you know, the hand up, not a hand out. But that's not a bad sentiment, that people get the dignity of at least not just having something shoved at them. You've probably, most of you heard before, but our oldest they have a thing in San Antonio called Christmas Under the Bridge, that all the homeless people who live under underpasses, one day a year, they come down and they bestow food and gifts on them. And it's all of the rich community leaders that show up bestowing upon the little people. And Amanda said, you know, the volunteers are out here doing things, but the important people are all huddled up in sort of a circle, and they're only talking to each other, and they don't want really anything to do with these poor people. We just want a photo op. We want a chance. And it really, I mean, it had an impact on her. The idea of saying, you know, I've got this entire harvest here. Let me give you some scraps. Instead, the people now, if they're crippled, obviously, you know, they can't do this. But if they can, they come out and glean. The word is Glean, it's glean. And they get to harvest for themselves, even if it's just the ends of the rows and the leftovers. This is a big thing within the Jewish culture. It is, again, some of this makes its way into the DNA. And so we saw that while we were there, we saw evidence of things where, wait a minute, they're not nearly as mean as I had been led to believe, are they? So this concept of gleaning is going to come up. That's just a preview of what's to come.
I'm just going to read, we're almost at the end, but I'm going to just read 2:1. Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a prominent man of noble character from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. Okay, so name was Boaz. Boaz's mother was Rahab.
We just got done with Rahab. This is Rahab's son.
I mean, is this like amazing? So this is Rahab's son. Rahab, after she, after her family was saved in Jericho, she married
Salmon.
I get that name wrong all the time. Married Salmon, and they had a son, and the son was Boaz. And here we are. Boaz now happens to be a member of the clan of Elimelech.
Since we have a few minutes, can I explain one other thing?
Mm-hmm.
So this is also going to be a preview for what's to come. And it's a really important concept. The land is their inheritance, right? It's given to them by God. And it's supposed to stay in the family. It's one of the reasons that this lineage is so important. It's supposed to stay in the family. If you have a sort of ne'er-do-well who likes to gamble or whatever, makes bad investments, that's almost worse than gambling in the Jewish culture. He makes bad investments, and now he's got to sell the land, right? You're not supposed to sell the land. It's a shameful thing to sell the land. Never let go of the land. But he has to, because he owes debt. They have something in the Old Testament, in the Jewish thing, that's called a goel. Goel, goel. A goel is usually translated to kinsman redeemer, okay? If you mess up and have to sell your land, a kinsman, a relative, kinsman redeemer can come in and pay the person who bought the land. Here's the money, it's my land. They have the absolute right to redeem that land. And often,
so it keeps it in the family.
It keeps it in the family. Sometimes it actually gets handed back, which is a strange concept to us, to restore the person who wasted it. It's strange to us, it's not strange to them. But a kinsman redeemer has that, and this goel is going to also figure prominently in the rest of this story. Boaz, when it says that Naomi has a relative from the clan of Elimelech, he's related to her dead husband, right? They're called, in the first, early part of this, they're called Ephrathites. Bethlehem, before it was called Bethlehem, was known as Ephrathah. So it just means they're from this Bethlehem area, and there's a clan of them called Ephrathites. But anyway, we're given some clues. The beauty of this is, remember somebody telling it orally. The story gives you a hint of what's to come. Now, it just so happens that Naomi has a relative from the clan of Elimelech who is a wealthy and well-respected. He's a man of honor. This is a clue right here at the end for what comes next. You can see the story developing.
And the thing you don't want to forget, all those people that were listening to this orally, when they said, whose name was Boaz, they would always say, Boaz, Rahab's son. I mean, the part that when we read the Bible, oftentimes we don't know the rest of the story or the pre-story before it. And so we miss it. But anybody who was hearing this story was like, oh my gosh, Rahab, the prostitute that helped Jericho come down. This is his son.
Yep. And so you can't miss the elements of this story that they would have all known. So we're going to see the importance of this guy who just by sheer happenstance, Naomi's got this relative who's pretty wealthy, and everybody that understands the goel, the kinsman redeemer,
says there's hope.
Even if you haven't heard the story before, you have some idea of what's coming. Anything else?
Nope.
Gene?
I'm good.
All right.
Maybe.
You know, I always struggle to say a prayer on behalf of a lot of other people. We read these things, and our goal, our longing, is to find our way to your will, to a life more abundant. And we see that you inspired and left words that direct us there, that explain what that is. This has said, this loving kindness that you bestowed on each of us is also the thing you've shown us, that it's our job to bestow on other people around us, your children, people that you love. And you've put us here with a mission of doing that, even when there's no hope that we get back anything. If I ask for anything this week, it's that reminder. It's the belief that through this story, you show us the things that you have in store for us, the gift that you've given us that we get to show to other people. Remind us of that this week. Be with us, bring us safely back as we continue. Amen.
You guys can unmute yourself. And hi, Julie and Bob. I hope you weren't waiting too long. I saw you were trying to get in. Where are you driving to?
We are headed to Kearney, Nebraska. We're going to meet Bob's daughter for breakfast tomorrow before we head on to the rest of our trip.
In Nebraska?
Yes.
Hey,
Joe Bob.
Did you drive to
You're
Nebraska?
loving retirement. You're all over the place, girlfriend. It's always a
not
different
wanna be
state,
here
a different
when it's
country. I love it.
Yeah.
You drove to Nebraska?
Hot breakfast, Cindy.
Goodbye, everyone. Everyone have a blessed
Sorry, it's
week.
not loud in here and I can't hear anymore.
Good to see you all.
I'll talk to you guys. Have a good week, everybody. Thanks.
Hi, everybody.
Thank you, Scott and Mary.
Bye, y'all.
And I mean